Hello and welcome to the last presentation that we're putting together through Plymouth County Extension. If you liked these series of presentations, you can feel free to email me and perhaps we'll arrange another series in a few months or maybe this fall or winter. But we're going to go ahead and get started. This particular presentation, we're going to review the differences, some of the differences between some of the major house pests that you might encounter and what we might call maybe a guest, a house guest, where they might be incidental visitors to your house, and they're not particularly scary or that damaging. They just kind of make our ways into our homes because our homes are not these hermetically sealed bubbles. They do have slight gaps and things like that where certain insects can kind of creep in, but they're not going to cause a terrible amount of damage or cause any huge health impacts. So the first thing we're going to talk about is what like a natural undisturbed ecosystem and the ecology surrounding these house pests. So when we talk about urban entomology, which is just kind of the subset of the greater kind of scheme of entomology, we talk about different ecosystems, and a natural ecosystem would be completely untouched by humans. And this is very, very rare. Even the think of as being like maybe Miles Standish State Forest or Wampatuck State Park do have to some degree a level of human intervention. There are trails or lights from outside areas or roads leading through them, or maybe involvement of invasive animals and plants going into those areas. So they're not completely untouched by humans. We might want to refer them to the more like undisturbed ecosystems. But the major thing about a natural ecosystem is that they have all the kind of inner workings of the natural native plants and animals, and their food webs and everything are all intact. But humans kind of play this kind of role where we have gone through and we basically laid our hand and we've touched almost everything on the face of the planet. And some environments tend to be more shaped than others. So we talk about some of the ways we kind of shape our environments and how we develop land. We might cut down some of these forests, and this would represent a more extreme case of a disturbed environment. And so when you get into this kind of concept of this gradient going from an undisturbed area, maybe an agricultural area where you just have farmland, and then going from that to maybe a suburban area, and then from an urban area, you see this kind of gradation. And you can see that if you just kind of pull up Google Maps, you can see this, what we call like maybe an urban sprawl from Boston. And it's not even an isolated area at this point. It's almost fully connected to all the different towns and cities that are, you can see all this intricate network of roads. And you can see all the gray areas just kind of interspersed with a lot of the green areas as well. But there are some animals that have become incredibly resilient to this urbanization. So while we are destroying some habitats and those habitats are completely lost, there are some animals that are either resilient to the change, they can live just about anywhere, or there are some animals that actually tend to prefer these man-made environments. And these are the kind of animals that you're gonna see kind of creeping up inside your typical homes and cities and things like that. So your urban ecosystem, what you tend to think of as a city, tends to be about 60% surface area consisting of either hard surface like paved roads or maybe the tops of buildings or built structures. So on average, you get about 30% of like a city area covered by just pavement and roads. And then there's going to be other areas like, for instance, like the town parks, like city parks and things like that, that are not going to be those hard paved surfaces. In the context of urban entomology and urban ecology, we would still consider like a suburban environment to still be an urban ecosystem. Because if you were to look at this, for instance, this suburban neighborhood, there's still a very large degree of human intervention. The entire landscape of this area, even though it has plants, is completely designed by humans. Nothing about that is natural. The American lawn is it's not a native species of grass. It's imported into this country, and we shape it. We add, chemicals. We cut it all the time. It is in no way like the natural habitat for a lot of these insects. So we still would consider this urban. Now, if you went into another field of study, I mean, the term urban has a bunch of different meanings, but just in this particular context, it does refer to suburban habitat. And we will consider this about 60% green space and maybe about 40% built landscape. So there are some kind of more forested areas that are more untouched in these particular habitats. And so when you kind of look at the urban landscape, you do see some vegetation. So you've got trees, and if you look at these trees, again, in no way is it a natural formation of trees. We planted these in a certain structure. We pick and choose what species we want to plant in a certain environment, and we pick where it's going to be. And there's different things like how the buildings and structures form, the different wind paths for wind to kind of go through, how the heat and the solar rays kind of hit that environment is going to be different than natural ecosystem. And then we form other kind of almost container-like structures that are different than you would find in a native environment. So you think like maybe the tops, like the third floor or the attics of certain houses provide like a warm, protected environment for certain animals. In between the walls of houses, in between like the siding and the walls of houses, you might find a space. So for something like a honeybee, it's a cavity nesting insect. It not only nests in the cavities of trees, might find the gaps in the sides of your home to be very similar to those gaps in the sides of trees. And then basements are an interesting feature because they provide this environment that's warm and humid that is completely different than the natural environment that you would find in New England. I mean, we keep these artificially heated. We have things like washing machines and the way that things drain and the way the humidity kind of concentrates in those areas form an environment that might be more similar to one that you might find in maybe a Mediterranean climate, just kind of in our basements. And we do see this in the mass transit systems too, where you do have this artificially kind of warm and humid environment that would not really be formed under native natural conditions. And then we have things like our sewers that we've constructed, and we think of these as just kind of being areas where your waste goes. But for certain insects and certain animals, this is actually a habitat that we have created. You've got water, you've got food for something that maybe eats poop, you've got food, and then if you've got some certain kinds of actual food being flushed down into those systems, being disposed of in those systems, you've got more food. So it's a nice sheltered habitat with all the things that certain animals would need to survive. And you've even got things like these kind of catch basins where water will collect. And if you think for a mosquito, which we had talked about in the previous episode, they really like standing water. So when you have this water kind of running off, continually being replenished in this catch basin, it almost creates this like perfect environment for mosquitoes to breed. And I'm always kind of reminded of how Pennywise from the movie It kind of lived in these kinds of environments. That's kind of the way I think of these kind of habitats. So maybe you've got mosquitoes and you've got clowns living down there. And then you've got things like garbage collecting, where we kind of concentrate all this garbage. It's got wasted food, where again, we went over in a previous presentation about 1 in every 3 bites of food ends up in a landfill. So you've got plenty of food, you've got plenty of containers, all kind of being concentrated in this one area. And so dumps and landfills end up being another source of habitat for certain animals. And you can see these containers, you know, they provide all this shelter, especially if they're plastic. That's a permanent shelter, permanent home for some of these animals. Tires, again, a really good home for certain animals. So what do our homes and what do kind of these shelters offer that you wouldn't find in nature? Well, they're shelters and they're harborages. In some cases might be permanent. We spend a lot of time and energy and money maintaining them to make sure that they're standing. And for an insect, that could be very appealing. And the big thing about the homes is that they maintain very stable environmental conditions. So you've got this nice warm home and it's cold outside. And for a lot of insects, the New England cold weather tends to be the thing that kills off a lot of these insects. But if they have a way to kind of get into the home, well, that's a really nice way to survive and kind of weather the storm. And we've just provided that for them. And like I mentioned earlier, our homes they're not these hermetically sealed bubbles. As much as we try and, I've gone outside, I've taken spray foam and things like that, really tried to seal up the gaps in the sides of my house, but there's going to be undoubtedly some kinds of things that it just happens. I'm not even sure where it could be at this point. I've tried sealing up every available section of the outside of my home, and some things get in. So what is a drawback of living inside of a home? Well, we don't like them, so we try to get rid of them. But the big thing about living inside a home is that oftentimes food is very limited. When you're an insect and you live outside the environment, you've got the world at your disposal. If you're something that feeds on rotting wood, well, then you have tons of trees falling down in the forest, tons of rotting wood. If you're something that feeds on sugary substances, well, you've got sap, you've got aphids secreting honeydew. The food is very plentiful. Inside a home, we try to keep them very clean, and we try to prevent those kinds of things from happening. And so food it's hard to come by inside a home. And the particular conditions might not necessarily be suitable for some species. Like if you're something that needs to nest underground, and there's not a thick layer of soil, well, that wouldn't be the case. Or if you need a specific level of humidity, that wouldn't be the case. That's one of the reasons why we don't really find deer ticks. They can't infest our homes, is because the level of humidity is not high enough for a deer tick to survive. They actually need about 82% or more humidity. And inside a home, it's generally about 70-ish%, 70 to 80. And so even like right now, where it might be muggy outside, a deer tick would have a very hard time surviving inside a human structure. But for some species, food can be easily found inside homes, because this is just the food our homes are either constructed with the type of food that they eat, or they're just well adapted to the kinds of things that kind of fall onto the ground, or they're things that we bring into our house that are their natural food sources. And then some might be adapted to these indoor conditions. Maybe they evolved in other parts of the world to kind of take advantage of these conditions. As I mentioned earlier, our basements might be this warm, humid environment, maybe similar to a Mediterranean climate. So if we brought in, say, a Mediterranean species, they might be able to live in our basements because we provided that atmosphere for them. And these are the insects that tend to become the pests inside our areas, because this is almost like their natural habitat that we've kind of formed. But when it comes to our homes, we really don't want anything inside that we didn't ask to come in. That includes anything. Like we don't want people inside our homes that we didn't ask to come in. We don't want insects. It applies to just about our homes. Are these sacred structures that tend to be our where we go to kind of unwind, and everything's safe and contained, and we try to keep it that way. And there are a lot of really companies that try to capitalize on that aspect and really try to scare us, to try to make us think that just about anything that comes in is bad. If you look at these pest control companies, they've got people screaming. They say things like buzz bites, sting, scream, and they show a bunch of like amorphous types of things that you can't even really identify. When they don't show real pictures of insects on these, it really brings into question how good they are at identifying insects. At least in my opinion, it makes me think that they're not very good at their jobs. And then they say things like "save your family from," and then there's another thing. There's never just one. And so they're all these things. They're trying to market fear so that they can come in and charge you money to try to prevent these. And if you're thoroughly enough afraid of these insects, if you just see a single one of them, then you're going to call them, pay them a lot of money, and then they're going to spray your house again. And in my opinion, that's not very ethically sound, because oftentimes, even if there's a single one, it might not necessarily be bad for your house. And then there's the overexposure of different pesticides and things like that that could be an issue. So these things kind of need to be balanced. In entomology, we like to refer to something called IPM, integrated pest management, where you don't rely on any particular method to control insects. It's not just chemicals. Some of it's habitat modification, and a lot of it is identification and things like that, where who knows, If you see a spider, maybe it's just a one-off and then that's okay. You don't necessarily need to call a company to come in and spray your house. But some people really go over the top. They are deathly afraid of insects to the extent where it's almost like biting off your nose to spite your face. And so it's one of those things where this level of fear kind of needs to be moderated. And that's really kind of my goal with this presentation, is not to scare people about these, but just to be able to get people to recognize the good versus the bad, so they're not doing things like burning down their house to save, or to kind of get rid of one thing that might not be that big of a deal. So what I'm going to tell you right up front is that most of the bugs, the vast majority of bugs that you see inside your home, are not all that bad. Most of them are actually things that you can kind of live with. And I know what you're thinking. This is one of those things, it's one of those obstacles that's really, really hard to get over. And I can completely understand if when you walk away from this, you're like, that guy was nuts. I'm going to still go ahead and kill squash, do whatever I need to do, but at least I tried. And that's kind of what I'm trying to get at. So for most of the bugs that you come across, they're transient, which means they come and go. They're in very small numbers. If you have high numbers of any species, even if it's one of these things that we go over, it might indicate another problem. And so it's not necessarily the bug that's the problem, but it might indicate something else is wrong with the home. Either a problem with moisture, collecting an abundance of moisture, leading to rotting in your house, or maybe there's a particular kind of a large hole inside your home that is allowing these insects to come in. If you have a large numbers of any of these, it could indicate something else is going on, and that's something that you should definitely investigate. But if you do see small numbers of these, I wouldn't sweat it too much. And a lot of these tend to be more of a nuisance that I'm going to go over rather than a health threat. So even things like spiders are not necessarily really what we would consider medically significant. So house centipedes and spiders, they really do kind of look like the stuff are made out of, especially the house centipedes, where they tend to be really, really creepy. These are the things that you wake up at 1 a.m, you're kind of half asleep, you're kind of wandering into the bathroom, you flick on the lights and you see this thing kind of move out of the corner of your eye, and you look at it and you're like, oh my gosh, like it just kind of like takes you back, because it's this thing with all these little legs and it's just kind of staring at you, and then it just kind of darts away. They're actually quite benign. I'm a very weird person, and I actually used to keep them as pets. You can't do that. It's not something that I would recommend doing if your parents don't want to. But they're really easy to take care of. I used to feed them gypsy moths and winter moths, which people hate gypsy moth and winter moth. So that was a cool thing. But they're almost like the lions inside your home. The spiders in this house and bees are like the lions. So they're going to be eating a lot of the things that you actually don't like. A lot of the things like the ladybugs or the stink bugs that come into your home, these are going to be eating those. Which is why I was saying, if you see an overabundance of these things, that it might indicate another problem. Like if you have a very large amount of house centipedes, well, they're feeding on something. Their entire population is going to be dependent on how much food is available, which means that there are a lot of other types of insects and things that they're feeding on in order to get that large population. There are spiders in particular I kind of want to review, because these are maybe the most villainized kind of bug out there, and they're really not that bad. Up here, we really only have the northern black widow, and I haven't seen a study on these in terms of how aggressive or defensive they can be. But for the western black widow spider, which is related, they are very, very tame. In this particular study, they were prodded over and over and over again, and only 2% of these attempted to bite. The 98% of these spiders would just want to run. They just try to run away, or they tried to throw silk, or they just really tried to get away. And this is researchers taking like a gel finger, and they were just constantly poking these spiders and just really harassing them. And it was only 2% that attempted to do this. And then they took the spider and they took it and they pinched it between these artificial fingers, and only 60% of them tried to bite. So even when they were faced with certain death, 40% of them still did not try to bite. And then out of these bites, the majority of these bites yielded no measurable venom. So these spiders, even though they have the name widow and people think of them as being super dangerous, they're not very dangerous at all. They don't really like to bite. Even if you try to kill them, they still don't want to bite. And even when they bite, they're more often than not injecting venom. And so it's one of those things, like, I think that the whole fear around them is not really justified. And it is kind of one of those things where the fear isn't really justified, and the fear is more over the top. So this other study, there was 182 people, and they were surveyed. They had gone in complaining about a spider bite and showing a bad, almost skin condition, and only 4% out of that 182 actually had spider bites. The rest of the 96 actually had skin infections that they had thought were caused by spiders. And so when people come up and they say, oh, I was bit by a spider, it was really, really bad, you can't tell me they don't bite. Well, most of the people who think they've had spider bites, it's not actually a spider bite, it's something else. And then we talk about like things like the daddy long legs. Some people think that they say it's the most dangerous spider in the world, but it just has fangs, they can penetrate your skin. There's so many things wrong with that, that it's hard to kind of cover it all in one sentence. But what we're going to talk about is this is what we call harvestmen. One, they're not true spiders at all. Two, they don't have venom, so they're not deadly at all. And three, they don't even have true fangs. If you look at the kind of their mouth parts in the front, they're more like grasping structures where they kind of pick up food, and so they're not going to bite. And they're not even predators. They're more scavengers, so they're going to pick up these things and kind of. They eat things like bird poop and leaf litter and detritus, and they just kind of eat that. So they're not a deadly spider in any way, shape, or form. And then we have our pests of stored products. So the spiders, the house centipedes, and the daddy longlegs, these are the things that you really don't have to worry about at all. The next thing, this is kind of the next level up. And these are the pests of stored products where they can be an issue if you see them in high numbers, but they're not usually medically significant. So things like carpet beetles, I've never gone into a home and not seen some evidence of carpet beetles. You've got cigarette and drugstore beetles, and you've got like clothes moths and things like that. These insects are well adapted to stored food and things like real animal products. And this is because they tend to break down a lot of the things found in nature. So something like a bird nest, they might live in a bird nest where they're eating all the feathers and things like that in a bird's nest. And so when you have a down jacket that you bring in, and now that has bird feathers in there, these things might be attracted to the kind of the feathery material. It might be very similar to that bird's nest out in the wild. And so that's a fresh food source for them. And so they're able to kind of live off of that. And so you can look for evidence of them, stored, in things like flour. This dog bone clearly has evidence of insect damage. Stored bird seed, grains, and things like that. You can kind of keep track of these stored pests. Like I said, they tend not to be an issue unless they get into really large infestations. In those particular cases, they would require some management. And then the other thing about them is, unlike spiders and house centipedes and harvestmen, they can cause damage to our products. So things like sweaters, like wool. Again, wool is an animal product, so they're going to be after that. It's a natural product. Down jackets. I once interacted with this couple, and they had a nursery that they were setting up, and they had tons and tons of drugstore beetles inside that room. And it turns out they had I can't remember if it was a beanbag chair or if it was a stuffed animal that they had, but it had real beans inside that, and they were coming from that food source. And so that was one thing to check. And when they got rid of that item, the beetles actually just went away. They disappeared. They were no longer to be found because they were living off of that food source, and you got rid of it and they were gone. The other thing is that if people have things like mice, or if they have yellow jackets living in their home, or even like a bald-faced hornet or a honeybee living in their home, very often they will get rid of that mouse or that primary pest, but the nest is still left behind, and then that can provide food for some of these other things like the carpet beetles. Like if you look at this nest that this mouse has made, you've got all kinds of nice fabrics and natural materials that a carpet beetle may look at as a food source. And if you got called an exterminator and they got rid of the mouse, but the nest was behind, well, the carpet beetles might then be feeding off of that. The big thing about these stored product pests is that the rule of thumb is that if you get rid of the food source, the pest goes away. That's almost always the case. If you find that food source, you get rid of it, and that pest will just eventually die out. There's nothing more for that pest to eat, and so it's gone. And it's very, very, very rare that it requires chemical management. And chemical management alone is not going to get rid of the pest. It's just a Band-Aid. So you're spraying, killing those pests, and that's going to be temporary. The chemical wears off. They're still breeding in that area, and they still kind of come out. And then you have to call the exterminator again, and you can spend a lot of money on spraying for these insects. And if you don't get rid of the nest, you're just going to keep flushing your money down the toilet. You've got to get rid of that food source. But there are things you can do to preemptively protect your valuables. Things like mothballs to protect stored clothing, keeping things in sealed containers. I like to do a lot of fly fishing, and I tie my own flies. And the flies are made out of things like feathers, bucktail, a lot of natural products. And these are perfect food sources for these types of insects. And so I keep those things in very tightly sealed containers where the insects can't get into. Chemical intervention can help, particularly, like I said, if you have a huge infestation, but if it's not going to be very useful if you don't also get rid of the food source. So if you get rid of the food source, then you have the chemical intervention, you're going to get rid of those pests sooner than if you only got rid of the food source. So it can help, but you really have to keep in mind that it's not going to solve the situation. Then we have kind of maybe along the same level, maybe not the next step up, but kind of the same level of pests are what we call like the shelter seekers. And these are going to be more seasonal, where our homes, they're not going to find a lot of food inside our homes, but these are the kinds of insects that like to overwinter inside these warm shelters. So if you look at this brown marmorated stink bug, it tends to kind of overwinter underneath bark in these kind of warm environments. And our homes are just a place for it to stay for the winter until it reemerges in the spring. And so these are the things like the brown marmorated stink bug, leaf-footed bugs like this western conifer seed bug, and the multicolored Asian lady beetle. These things overwinter inside these protected structures in our homes. They make their way into our home because they're warm, and then there aren't a lot of ways for them to escape, and so they sometimes they get lost and they can't make their way out in the spring, and they get trapped, and sometimes we can find them dying. But if there are large gaps in your screens or in your siding, you may see larger numbers kind of coming into your house, especially in the fall and winter. The ways you kind of protect yourself against these pests are that you can replace screens. Replacing screens, it can be expensive, but that's one of the #1 ways of protecting yourself against these. Sealing the gaps in your siding, and closing the windows before the sun sets can be really advantageous, particularly with the southwest facing side of your home, where that's the last spot of your house that the sun hits. So it's usually the warmest side of your house, and the insects kind of congregate on that side of your house. The sun hits it, warms it up, and then as it starts to cool, and your house is still warm on the inside, they kind of look to find ways inside to maintain that warmth. And so if you close your windows and seal that all up before the sun sets in the fall, you can mitigate the numbers of pests coming into your home. And then you have manual removal. The way you want to get rid of these is generally manual removal, vacuum cleaner, just putting them outside, killing them, squishing them. Chemical intervention with these is never necessary. They're not going to come in, infest your home, live like that in multiple life cycles. It's just not likely to happen. I can't say never, but it's not likely to happen. And so you really don't want to call an exterminator to come in. It's just one of those things that you're not really going to have to do. Uh, for the brown marmorated stink bug, you can create things like these light traps where they tend to be really attracted to this like reflective surface where you have like the light glistening off the surface of the water. They really, really like that. And so you have this kind of pan where you have the light reflecting off that. Creates this nice and kind of attractive trap. The brown marmorated stink bug, it goes towards the light and then ends up dying. If you have like the soapy water kind of creating that reflective surface, they kind of drown in that water. And so that's one way you can kind of collect them. I wouldn't recommend doing this if you have a lot of children because you've got this desk lamp hanging over water. That seems like a recipe for disaster. But if you've got an attic where not that many people go and it's only adults, you can set up one of these traps and you can collect the brown marmorated stink bugs that way. So what makes an insect a serious pest? And this is kind of where we get into like almost like the scary part of the presentation. These serious pests, they come in high numbers. They're usually, they can be a health threat. They can cause a large amount of damage to our possessions, and they can cause a large amount of damage to the structures of buildings. And these are the things that you want. These are the kind of pests that you want to get good at recognizing, because if you see them, then that's something to maybe ask for a professional opinion, and that might require maybe chemical intervention or an exterminator or a pest control operator. So the good news is that there aren't too many serious pests. So what are the ones that you should worry about? Well, accurate identification of these is critical because the management varies quite a bit. There are some pesticides that if you just spray, it's going to kill everything. But if you want to kind of minimize your exposure to chemicals, maximize your control over something, you almost always want to have very good, accurate identification, because there are some ways that you can treat things and get rid of them and minimize the amount of spray that you use, or you can target certain sprays at certain times of the year where they're most effective. So here's a good example. This is actually a case that I worked on in Plymouth County, where a woman had been complaining of bed bugs being inside her home. And the pest control operator that she had hired kept spraying and spraying her house, and she spent over $10,000 on bed bug removal, combined with throwing away old fur coats and things that she had, getting rid of a lot of her whole wardrobe had to be like dry cleaned and washing it. And this happened multiple times. It just kept happening. And the pest control operator kept coming in, kept spraying, and she just kept spending all this money. She eventually got fed up with it, and she contacted me, and she asked, she goes, "Are these bat bugs or bed bugs? Because I heard about something called bat bugs." And I put them under the microscope, and lo and behold, they were bat bugs and not bed bugs. So what's the big deal? Why should it matter? Well, the insecticide the pest control operator was spraying, that's going to kill the bat bugs. But the biggest issue is that bat bugs are brought in by bats. So even if you're killing all the bat bugs in your house, they're going to continually be brought in. And this pest control operator never removed the bats, and they never blocked up the entrance to prevent bat entry. And so this was one of those things where they were gladly taking this woman's money, but they weren't solving the problem. And where accurate identification would have saved her thousands of dollars. They could have sealed up that entry. And in fact, with the case of bat bugs, there are cases where you can just keep the bats from coming in, and they don't require any chemical management. The bat bugs just kind of go away on their own. And so that is one way that I have heard of people treating for bat bugs. And so that might have required very little monetary investment. She certainly wouldn't have needed to really do all the stuff like throwing away all of her clothing and dry cleaning all that. It wouldn't have been as big of a deal. And just the emotional stress that it caused her to constantly have to deal with this over the course of years. And that's just one of the things that accurate identification can really, really help with. So one thing I do kind of want to warn you about is that if you're eating something or if you are squeamish, that you kind of just brace yourself, because some of the pictures and some of the images in this particular section can be a little, it can be a lot. It can be a little much. Even for someone like me who likes bugs, I have a hard time looking at some of these sometimes. So termites are one of the big things that you may encounter. They're one of the major pests that you can encounter in our area, and they can cause huge amounts of structural damage. You can see this in this wood where it's just really eaten the wood. The big thing about termites versus things like carpenter bees and carpenter ants is that these termites actually ingest wood. So a carpenter ant and a carpenter bee, they don't eat the wood. They just create cavities inside that wood where they live, and they're not actively eating it. For termites, the wood is a part of their diet. So our wooden homes are just a giant food source for them. In Massachusetts, what we have are these subterranean termites. We don't have the termites that create the big mounds like you might see in some photos from, say, Africa or Madagascar. We have subterranean termites. And as far as I know, this is the only type of species that we have in the Northeast. And they create these mud tubes. It kind of reminds me of the scene from Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, where you have this kind of mud, kind of chocolatey substance, like shooting this boy up. But you have these tubes that this is how they navigate and how they kind of get into our homes. And this is one of the things you want to look for in terms of noticing a termite infestation, is the presence of these mud tubes. Other signs of termites are winged adults. And the important thing is, if you see these like wings that are just without any insects involved, just kind of wings on the windowsill or on the ground, or it might be in the attic or on the third floor, you just kind of see these wings kind of strewn about, that could be a serious sign of termites. And whenever you have the winged forms, these are the reproductive forms. So you have something reproducing in that house. Ants, like carpenter ants, the ants I'm going to very briefly go over them because there are many, many, many species of ants. And so ants are one of the things where you kind of want to identify them. They can be really gross. Carpenter ants can cause damage to wood, but as I mentioned, they're typically not as bad as termites in terms of the extensive damage. Like if you have termites, you really need to call an exterminator very, very quickly. With carpenter ants, oftentimes it's one of those things that it's going to happen over a longer course of time, this amount of structural damage. How do you tell the difference between ants and termites? Well, termites have almost this like barrel body where there's almost no constriction in their waist. They kind of have just that straight body. Ants always have this constriction around their waist, and that's one of the big ways you can kind of tell the difference. In addition to things like color, if you see the winged forms, the termites used to be in the order Isoptera, where Isoptera mean like they had separate wings. And so this is kind of the way you can kind of recognize termites, is that they're very clumsy flyers and they have 4 separate wings, Isoptera, and they're all the same length. And that's kind of where the name comes from, is like same wing, Isoptera. In carpenter ants, it's different. Their wings are paired off. And so it might only look like their front and back wings are attached. So they when they show them, they're almost might look like just a single pair of wings. So the wings are different. With termites, their antennae almost look like a string of beads. And with ants, especially the carpenter ants, they have this thing called a scape. It's this long, like almost like arm, like kind of elbow structure. And then they have the antenna coming off of that. Bedbugs. Bedbugs are probably the worst pest that, in my opinion, they are the worst pest that you can have inside your home. Presence of bedbugs, you might see these kind of bloods, this is really kind of the bedbug poop stain. You can look and bedbugs can kind of nest. This is actually what this is that this is a hole that a nail left behind, and they're all eggs inside there. And so they can lay the eggs in really small, tight crevices. If you see a bedbug, it's really important to have that identified. If you suspect it might be a bedbug, you always want to get that identified just to make sure. I know they can be really hard to look at. Which one is the bedbug and which one is the bat bug? The big difference between the bedbugs and the bat bugs is that the bat bugs are really hairy. So if you look at the bedbug on the left, you can see the hairs along this pronotum, which is almost like it's the front part of the thorax. And you can see these hairs along the edge of that. They're really short. They don't go up as long, like they don't extend longer than where the eye is. But the bat bug, these hairs are really long and they extend longer than this eye. And so that's the big really the biggest way to tell the difference between the bed bugs and the bat bugs. Cockroaches, another really kind of annoying pest we have. They're not as medically significant, but they can cause known human allergens. They can cause things like asthma. They can spread pathogens. So they're not something like gonna give you like triple E or like a Lyme disease, but they can be really serious because they grow in such large numbers and they can be really dirty. The thing about cockroaches is that in the US we have about 69 species, and of those 69 species, there's only like 3 or 4 that you really need to worry about. Most of them are not all that bad. In our particular area, some common species we see are these, and these kind of end up in people's houses, but these are not going to infest your home. So on the left, we have the Mediterranean spotted cockroach, the adult, and the nymph, the baby form. And these, honestly, they have a 2-year life cycle. I tried to keep these as pets before, and I had a really hard time even keeping them as pets. So when you see one inside your home, it's not really going to generate an infestation. And on the right, we have wood roach. They're in the genus Parcoblata. This is, and they're, again, same thing. They're going to have a really hard time infesting your home. If you see one, it might have been attracted to the light and made a find a way through your screen. And it just kind of ended up in your house. And if it's a one-off, again, it's going to be really hard for these particular species to establish your home. So if you see one, it's not really necessarily a cause for concern. You can either let it outside or do whatever you want with it. I'm not going to judge you. The German cockroach, however, is the worst. But this cockroach is the major species of cockroach that you're going to have to worry about. So what is the German cockroach? The German cockroach is a small cockroach, and it reproduces in very, very large numbers. And this is the cockroach that most people tend to be kind of freaked out about. And I'm going to show you what it looks like and how you can kind of differentiate this cockroach.
It looks like a cricket.
Cockroaches that you might see in your house. So the German cockroach has these kind of like racing stripes on its back. And this is one of the major ways that you can kind of detect a German cockroach. There is another species of cockroach that has these stripes, but we tend not to see it in the Northeast. So this, and that's another one that you want to watch out for. So if you see these 2 little black stripes on the they call it the pronotum, it's the front of the thorax. If you see it on the pronotum of the cockroach, that is something that you really kind of want to be like, oh shoot, I need to get this identified. You don't see those racing stripes, and then this is something that probably isn't going to be a huge big deal. Other cockroaches that we kind of have in our area, this is the Oriental cockroach. And these cockroaches, one of the reasons why they're not as bad as the German is that they tend to require more specific conditions to infest, generally more humid, more warm conditions, so people tend to see them more in their basements and things like that. Versus the German cockroach, you'll see that everywhere, bathrooms, kitchens. Like German cockroach is like just very common to see in a lot of different locations, but the Oriental cockroaches tend to be more restricted in the areas that they colonize. The American cockroach is really big, and this is the one that you'll tend to see in subways in Boston. These cockroaches, I don't think I've ever seen them in like a suburban kind of residential environment because they tend to require very warm and humid environments. So I see them in subways, and they're big, and you can tell that it's an American cockroach because, again, on that pronotum area, you can see how it's yellowish. The American cockroaches have that. They don't have like the racing stripes, and again, these are really, really big. And then you have the brown banded cockroach, and you can see the nymphs. The younger forms have these light colored bands, and then you can see the dark bands on the legs of the adults. And so these are kind of the things that you can kind of use to tell the difference between some of these cockroaches that are good and bad. If you see any cockroach, you can always just get it identified. Just kind of put your mind at ease. But just kind of keep in mind that there are cockroaches that are going to make their way into your home that don't necessarily infest. If you see them time and time again, it doesn't necessarily mean there's an infestation. They could just be a gap in your screen, and they're just kind of making their way in there. So I know this is a lot, and that it might be a little intimidating and scary. I think there's a reason why this presentation isn't as popular as some of the other ones that I've had. I'm hoping that you guys feel a little bit more empowered by this presentation, because knowing what is a pest and what isn't can really help. And at least for me, it helps put my mind at ease knowing if I see something that it's not something I should be worried about, or knowing kind of what to look out for can be really useful. One of the things you can do to identify these pests, because I couldn't go over the identification completely in this presentation, is some of these phone apps can be really good at identifying the pests in our homes. And one of the reasons behind that, the phone apps tend to be really good at commonly seen species. And so the phone apps, this is one of the almost a perfect use for these phone apps, because the pests inside homes generally are commonly encountered. But one thing I would recommend is that even if it gets identified as a particular species with these apps, that you double check that against a professional, because with the apps, the only way you know you're wrong and you know that the app is wrong is if you already know the right answer. So there's almost no way to know that without double checking it. You can ask for help on Facebook. One of the things that I almost kind of you usually get a pretty good answer, but one of the reasons why I shy away from these kinds of things is that, one, do you really want to be broadcasting whether or not you have bed bugs in your house all over social media? And two, you tend to get a lot of bad pest control management advice from these. People tend to react in very visceral and very over-the-top ways. Again, the burn it with fire, bug in your house, like all these different things. You don't want to follow that on Facebook, but sometimes you can get a very quick identification through some of these sites. Same thing with Reddit. If you do decide to go this route, which I'm not hugely enthusiastic about, make sure you include the date and the location. That's very important. One of probably the best things you can do is ask an extension educator like me. You can also ask UMass; they're really good. But just ask an extension educator, and they can be really helpful and get you an accurate identification. For someone like me, where I'm local, you can actually bring me a specimen, or I'd be happy to even go and collect one for you if you can't get a solid picture of that insect. If you have trouble taking photos, and sometimes I get photos like this, they're incredibly blurry, just try to get a little bit closer. This particular insect, I've gotten really good at kind of making out blurry images. And as soon as I saw this blurry image, I'm like, okay, that's a cockroach. Just because I'm good, I've gotten better at that over time. But in order to take better photos, sometimes you need to get really up close. And these insects can be really intimidating. So I understand that. And if you wanted to just collect something and give me a specimen, that's one way we can do things. And with management of pests, don't mess around with trends. I've heard of people doing weird things like duct taping their electrical outlets, or just doing really bizarre things that they look up online. You really don't want to do that. The best way to get rid of any of these pests is to hire an expert. Proper treatments are very effective. They're proven with science. And you don't want to be messing around with something that's new and just hasn't really been tested. Take the thing seriously. If you're going to hire someone, take it seriously and get rid of it completely. And last but not least, try not to worry too much. I know these things can be really concerning. With my fiance, whenever we see something in the house, I know she worries a lot about these things. So I really try to just relax her and be like, you know, it's not really that big of a deal. We're just going to let it outside. And just kind of get rid of it, and just kind of put her mind at ease. I just really try to explain things and just let her know that we had a case where we had seen a few garden ghost spiders in our house, and she was really worried about those spiders. And I just tried to reiterate that they're not going to just infest our home and just take over our home like arachnophobia. That they're okay, and that just because we saw 2 of them, it's not a big deal. And at this point, we'll take any questions.